this video, we're going to talk about the lab for user-defined methods. So we go to our user-defined methods module. We'll scroll down to the bottom. And we have the lab assignment. You're going to need to download all of these files. And you can do that by right-clicking, download linked file as. We have 7 .java files and 1 lab write-up document. The lab write-up document is going to give us a description of what we need to change and modify in these files to complete the lab. So we open up all of our files in .java, and we're going to go ahead and compile, select our game.java, and we're going to run it. So we get our game window. We have our flower, we have our caterpillars, we can move our flower around, but that's about it. There's not a whole lot going on. What do we need to do to add some gameplay here? Well, let's take a look at our lab write-up. Okay. What are we going to do in this lab? We are going to add some collision detection, and this will tell us if the player has collided with one of the caterpillars or enemies so that we can do something with that information later on. Maybe deduct some health points, or you could create some little animation to show that they've hit, make some sounds, anything. But first of all, how do we just get the collision detection working? Well, to do this, we are going to employ our methods. So first of all, in this lab, we're going to declare and define a method. We're going to use that method by calling it from a different function or a different method. And we're also going to write some test cases for our method. Make sure it works okay. Now, we already talked about the files we have in the modifications for this lab. You're going to code up the contains method in our game object.java. We're also going to need to call it from gameObject.java. And then in our test bench, again, we're going to need to call our contains method and add some unit test cases for it. Okay, we already talked about getting started. We ran our code once and we saw our game. Now there's a variable in gameObject.java called debug. It's a static private boolean, so this can be your true or false value. Right now it's set to false. If we go ahead and change that to true, save it, compile it, and select our game Java to run, we get the same thing we did before, except we have these nice red boxes around all of our game objects. And we move it around, the boxes move too. These bounding boxes give us a nice way to estimate where our graphics are. If we actually tried to figure out if two game objects were overlapping pixel by pixel, it would be very hard, it would be very cumbersome, tedious, and very expensive too. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to take our bounding boxes, and if they intersect, we're going to call that a collision between the flower and a caterpillar. And they can, you could call it collision, intersection. There's lots of different terms, but we're going to just say they collide. Okay. So before we go into the method implementation we need to put together. I'm going to introduce a new concept that we'll be really talking about a lot more in the next module, because this is actually an example of an object, but it's going to make our lives a little easier in this lab. So we're going to use one example of an object now. And that example is a point. And I think you've seen these in the code already. It's a pretty lightweight object. It just has two fields in it. It has an X and a Y, and they're both integers. And it does exactly kind of what you would think. It defines an XY coordinate, or a point. Here's an example of how to create one. We're calling it P. We call the new operator. And then we have this method where we initialize it with our XY values. Then to access these XY values, we just use this dot operator. So to get to our X value, we say P dot X, or P dot Y for our Y value. And the reason we're going to do this is for our function, we need to pass in 3 points, or 3 sets of coordinates, to find out if our if the test point we're looking at is actually inside of our bounding box. Now, if we didn't have our point to do this, we would have to send in 6 values, and it can get a little confusing about which value is what. So this point object gives us a nice structure that we can look at to help simplify the arguments into our method and to organize the data a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about what our function is going to be. So we're going to start off a little simpler than actually trying to figure out if 2 boxes are intersecting or colliding. We're actually just going to look at a point. We're going to say, does this point fall in our box? And to do that, we're going to need to pass in 3 points. The point we're evaluating or looking at, trying to figure out that's inside or outside, and then also some way to define this box. And we're going to do that through 2 points, the top left corner and the bottom right corner. And this gives us enough information to understand the entire box. So to see if our test point falls inside or outside of the box, it's actually some relatively simple calculations. Let's look at our example. If we wanted to just look at the x's, which is the first number in the pairs, we have our test point sitting at 30. Well, our box starts at 70 and ends at 100. Since 30 is not in the range of 70 to 100, we know that our test point can't be inside the box. This is also true for the x and y values too. Since 45 does not fall between the range of 45 and 85 inclusively, our test point is not inside the box. So we'll have to use some logic to check ranges, and I think you've done something similar like that in a previous lab. So hopefully this is something you've done before and you'll understand how to fill out our method, because we need to put that logic inside our method. So again, our method is going to take in 3 arguments: our test point, our top left corner, and our bottom right corner. It is going to do the calculations we just spoke about of seeing if our point falls within these ranges of the box. And then if our point does fall within the range of our box, we're going to return true, or we're going to return false if it falls outside. Just a reminder here, we're talking about static methods. So you need to declare the method static, like we declare all our main methods static in the code. If you don't declare a method static, you have to have an object to call it with. Again, this is something we will talk about when we get into our objects and classes down the road. Okay, so let's go back to our code. Now we're going to implement this in GameObject. And we're going to implement it in GameObject because our collides function that's already been written for us is going to need to call it. So I thought, okay, it's just easy, let's put it right above it. So I would code it up right here. Once you've got it coded, the next thing you're going to want to do is go to your test bench and now compile and run testbench.java. In testbench, what we need to do, we have this test contains, which is sometimes called a test harness, that inside of it we're going to call our contains method. And this function takes in the same 3 arguments that our method will, and it also takes a Boolean expected, which is what we think our function should be returning. This way, we can test that our method is working correctly. So there's one test that's already done for you, and you're going to need to replicate this a couple times. Once with a test case where we're going to test a point inside the rectangle or inside our bounding box, and another one where we're going to test a point outside of our bounding box. The current test case tests whether a point that's sitting on our bounding box is considered inside or outside. It should be considered inside. Okay. Once you've got that completed, we know that our function is working and we can actually use it in our code. So we go back to GameObject and we've got it coded up here, and it's going to be used within our collides function. Now our collides function, which has already been written for us, is going to make sure that the entire rectangle, if the whole thing or any part of it is colliding with one of the other bounding boxes that we're looking at. So we're going to take 2 bounding boxes and check if they're intersecting, colliding, whatever you want to call it. And to do that, all we need to do is check to see if any of our points, any of our corners of our box are inside the other box. And so we'll test all 4 corners, and that's what this function is doing here. But to do that, we need to call our contains method to see if each point is falling in the box or not. So we'll remove the false here, that's just to get it to compile, and then make a call to our contains method. Okay, once all that is working, we should be able to run our program. And let's take a look at our finished product. I'll close all of these files and open our solution. Let's compile and run. Okay, and now if we run into our caterpillar, we can see our console is printing, "You hit a caterpillar." So we can now see our intersections, or sorry, our collisions. All right. So to submit, you need to upload your GameObject.java and your testbench.java files. I hope this is a helpful overview of the assignment, and good luck.